I didn't enter their world with noise. There were no sudden disruptions, no declarations, no waves made in the surface of their carefully curated existence. Just presence, bare and quiet. I arrived like a whisper in a crowded room, barely noticed, but deeply felt by the ones who still remembered how to feel. The kind of arrival that doesn't seek permission. The kind that shifts the air without needing to claim it. The room was warm that day. Not with affection, but with performance, voices layered over each other like a script rehearsed too many times. Laughter that echoed a beat too late. Compliments delivered with sugar-coated edges. A fragile kind of harmony that only survives if no one breathes too deeply. And then I did. I stepped into that space with stillness trailing behind me like silk. The light through the high windows was soft, not golden, but dimmed, filtered, as if even the sun hesitated to shine fully in such a room. My shoes didn't click loudly on the floor. My coat didn't swing with drama. I walked in gently like fog, like a breeze. And somehow everything around me paused, not because I asked it to, but because something beneath their surface recognized the change. I wasn't loud. I wasn't flashy. But I saw. Not just the clothes, the posture, the way they arranged themselves like furniture in a showroom. I saw what pulsed beneath. The tension in their hands as they smiled. The flicker of emptiness behind eyes polished too well. I noticed how everyone danced around a center they never dared to name. And at that center, there he was, the one who had wrapped charm around pain so tightly even he couldn't tell the difference anymore. He didn't look up right away. Narcissists rarely notice what doesn't orbit them. But I wasn't there to orbit. I was the gravity they forgot existed. My silence unsettled something in that room. It was not the absence of sound, but the absence of expectation. I wasn't performing. I wasn't vying for attention. I wasn't falling into the roles they understood: admirer, enabler, follower. I was just present. And presence, when it holds no agenda, can feel like a threat to those who live behind masks. They mistook my softness for fragility. Assumed quietness meant caution. But my silence was not submission. It was seeing. Deep, steady, soul-level seeing. The kind of stillness that doesn't shrink, it observes, absorbs, and remembers. I didn't come to fit in. I didn't come to complete anyone's script. I came to reflect what had been lost: authenticity, depth, stillness. And though no one named it aloud that day, something shifted. The temperature in the room. The rhythm of the dialogue. The pulse beneath the pretense. They didn't realize it, but something sacred had just stepped into their life. And sacred things do not enter to play along. They enter to awaken. This was the quiet arrival, but it would not stay quiet for long. I gave without being asked. There was no transaction, no expectation of return. I didn't hand over pieces of myself like currency. I opened my hands and let the light in them spill freely, because that's what love meant to me. Not possession. Not performance. Just presence. Just offering. They didn't know what to do with that. I remember the first time I stayed late, when everyone else left, when the room was quiet and brittle and he sat in the center of it like a king losing his crown. I didn't ask what was wrong. I didn't try to fix. I just sat. A silent offering. Warmth without heat. Eyes that didn't look through but into. And he felt it. I know he did. The way his shoulders dropped just slightly. The way his mask faltered for a moment, not in collapse, but in fatigue. And still, he tested me. He would disappear only to return with charm slicked across his words like oil. He would say things that cut, not with directness, but with subtlety. He would forget, then blame, then pretend to remember only when it served him. And I forgave. Not because I didn't see, but because I did, deeper than he knew. I saw the root of it. The fear. The hollow ache beneath all the bravado. I thought my love could soften the walls. That my presence could untangle the pain he never named. I believed, foolishly maybe, that consistency could teach trust. That if I stayed long enough, gently enough, something inside him would remember how to receive something pure. So I offered. I offered patience when he hurled chaos like knives. I offered calm in the middle of storms he started, then blamed on the rain. I offered words that soothed, not because he deserved them, but because I refused to become like him. I wouldn't let his darkness rewrite the texture of my light. There were nights I listened to silences stretched too thin. Mornings I answered texts filled with blame. Days I gave more than I had and still found a way to give again. Why? Because something in me hoped. Hoped that if someone had stayed for me once, I might have become softer sooner. Kinder faster. I believed in what he could be, not what he was showing me. But he kept twisting my words until they were unrecognizable. He kept pushing my limits just to see if I'd snap. He kept taking and taking and taking, not out of need, but out of hunger for control. And I didn't break. I bent like branches in a storm, not out of weakness, but wisdom. I knew the difference between surrender and survival, between passivity and preservation. I adjusted, adapted, but I never disappeared. That, I think, confused him more than anything, because he had built a world where people broke or obeyed. And I didn't either. I stayed, not blindly, but willingly. I stayed not because I had no place to go, but because I chose to remain where love had not yet been learned. But even love has a cost. My hands, once open and warm, began to ache from holding so much. My voice, once soft with comfort, began to tremble with exhaustion. The light I gave? It dimmed not from regret, but from depletion. Because giving is beautiful until it becomes sacrifice without purpose. And still I offered, not to be sainted, not to be seen, but because that's who I was. Because love, in its truest form, doesn't ask what it will get back. It just shows up again and again. Until the silence answers. It was subtle at first, so subtle most would have missed it. A pause too long between sentences. A smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. A story told one way on Monday and another by Friday. The kind of inconsistencies that others might excuse as forgetfulness or eccentricity or stress. But I noticed. Not because I was searching for flaws, but because I was listening with more than my ears. He was used to shallow waters conversations that skimmed the surface, connections built on performance. He knew how to dazzle, how to command a room with practiced charm and convenient vulnerability. But I was different. I didn't lean forward with admiration. I didn't mirror his flattery. I didn't get lost in the glitter. I stood quietly at the edge, letting the waves break against me, and that stillness made him uneasy. He had never been seen in silence. One evening, we sat across from each other at dinner. He was retelling a story about an old friend, a tale of betrayal, of loyalty misplaced. But something in the way he told it didn't match the version I'd heard 2 weeks earlier. The details shifted. The villain changed. His voice tightened when I gently asked, "Are you sure that's how it happened?" He laughed. A little too loudly. His fork scraped the plate with more force than necessary. "Of course," he said, flashing that smile, but his eyes didn't follow. That's when I saw it, the flicker. That microsecond of panic. The twitch of someone not used to being questioned. Someone who expected applause, not inquiry. And I didn't push. I didn't confront. I simply watched, and that watching became unbearable for him. You see, narcissists don't fear rejection. They fear recognition. They spend their lives crafting masks, hero, victim, genius, martyr, and they survive by convincing others to believe in those roles. But I wasn't playing along. I didn't treat his charisma like currency. I didn't melt under the weight of his praise. I listened to the gaps, the hesitations, the way his stories always circled back to himself. He started fidgeting more, rushing his words, offering compliments wrapped in subtle corrections. There was a day, I remember it clearly, when he gave me a gift, then hours later mocked the way I thanked him. "So formal," he smirked. "You don't need to try so hard." But I hadn't been trying. I had been sincere. And he didn't know what to do with that. Because sincerity requires depth. And depth requires truth. And truth was the one language he had never learned to speak fluently. Still, I didn't judge. I saw the cracks not with satisfaction, but with sorrow. I saw the way he struggled to maintain the act, the way his posture stiffened when silence stretched too long, the way he'd deflect with humor when I simply looked at him too intently. I wasn't impressed. I wasn't chasing. I was just present. And that presence became his undoing. Because when someone only knows how to be loved through illusion, being seen in truth feels like exposure. Like vulnerability. Like danger. I began to notice how often he interrupted when I spoke about myself. How his empathy was performative, perfect words, no resonance. How he leaned into storytelling but avoided accountability. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow unraveling thread by thread until the fabric of who he claimed to be no longer held together under the weight of who he truly was. And I watched it happen not with cruelty but with quiet ache. Because I wanted him to be real. I wanted to believe the mask was just temporary, that beneath it there was someone ready to emerge. But some people wear masks so long they forget they ever had a face beneath them. And even though I stayed, even though I listened, he looked at me not as a companion, but as a mirror he could not control. And mirrors, when they stop reflecting fantasy, become unbearable. My presence was a mirror they couldn't shatter. Not made of glass, but something quieter. Still, like a pool of water untouched by wind. I didn't reflect who they wanted to be. I reflected who they were. And not through confrontation, not through lectures or accusations, but simply by being calm, steady, present. That kind of reflection is its own kind of violence to someone built on illusion. He was used to being admired, not seen. Worshipped, not witnessed. His world revolved around projection, a spotlight he could tilt however he pleased. But when I stood before him, there was no spotlight. There was only stillness. Only the gentle light of truth, unfiltered, unforced. He would speak in grand statements, the hero of every story, the victim of every betrayal, and I would nod, not in agreement, but in listening. Real listening. And that unnerved him more than any argument ever could. Because when someone is used to war, peace feels like danger. I remember the first time it showed, the discomfort. I had just complimented his creativity earnestly. "You have a gift for language," I said softly. He blinked too many times. Laughed. Shifted in his chair. "Well," he said, "not everyone gets me." His tone turned sharp as if he needed to prove something. But I hadn't challenged him. I'd only seen him. And being seen in truth felt like exposure. He began accusing me of being too sensitive. Said I overanalyzed, that I imagined slights where there were none. But it wasn't my sensitivity that cracked, it was his. His mask couldn't withstand stillness. His ego couldn't survive a gaze that didn't flinch. You see, I didn't offer praise to manipulate. I didn't offer love as a currency. I didn't chase validation or hold silence as punishment. I just existed. In clarity. And clarity, when held without agenda, is the most dangerous thing you can hand to someone who survives by distortion. I became a mirror, one that didn't distort, didn't soften, didn't curve to fit the fantasy. In my presence, he began to see the inconsistencies, the lies told too easily, the cruelty tucked into charm, the contradictions between word and deed. Not because I pointed them out, but because I didn't deny them. I didn't play the part. I didn't protect the illusion. And that made me the enemy. Because for people like him, love only feels safe when it's blind. And mine never was. Mine saw everything. The light and the shadow. The performance and the fracture beneath it. I offered understanding, not indulgence. And that too was a threat. Being blamed for simply being real is its own kind of heartbreak. To have your kindness weaponized. To be told you're calm is manipulation. To be accused of playing games simply because you refuse to play at all. Takes strength not to defend every lie with truth. Takes courage not to react when someone throws their shame at you and calls it your burden. But I stayed still, like water, unmoved, reflecting, not reacting, holding up the mirror not to wound, but to reveal, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that one day he'd look and not look away. Truth is not loud. It doesn't scream. It stands quietly in the middle of the chaos and does not blink. That was me. Not a storm. Not a sword. Just grace. Grace he could neither receive nor destroy. Because grace, like truth, cannot be manipulated. And that is what made it unforgivable. I wasn't their reward. I was their test. Not a prize. Not a punishment, a moment, an intersection between who they had always been and who they were still being invited to become. They prayed for connection, for peace, for someone who wouldn't betray them like all the others. And then I came, not with fire, not with judgment, but with gentleness, with honesty, with a kind of love they didn't recognize because it didn't beg to be needed. I didn't come to take anything. I came to reflect what they could still be if they chose the path of truth. But they didn't recognize me. They mistook my grace for weakness, my patience for strategy, my clarity for control, because they didn't know how to receive something that wasn't designed to feed their illusion. I watched them stand at the gate, a gate only opened once, forged from years of inner preparation, divine timing, quiet readiness. They stood there, facing it, facing me, and they walked away, not because they were confused, not because they didn't see, but because they did and feared what it would require. I didn't demand perfection. I didn't ask for performance. All I required was honesty. But to be honest, they would have to dismantle the mask. And the mask had become their skin. This wasn't about romance. This wasn't about desire. This was about transformation. The moment where a soul is handed a mirror and asked, gently, "Are you ready to see what you've become?" They weren't. They chose pride over healing, control over surrender, performance over presence. They told themselves they were being judged, when in truth they were being given mercy. Final mercy, an opportunity wrapped in softness, in stillness, in sacred discomfort. I was the last open door, the last candle before the dark, not to rescue them, but to invite them out of the narrative they'd been using to survive. They failed, not because they weren't capable, but because they weren't willing. They rewrote the story, said I was too much, said I wanted too deeply, too soon, too real. They recited their excuses with the same precision they used to avoid their own shadow. But this wasn't a human test. This was a spiritual one, and spirit cannot be fooled by charm. They don't realize yet, but one day they will. They'll remember the stillness, the way the air felt different around me. They'll replay the moment they turned away, and they'll realize they didn't just reject a person. They rejected a divine invitation. They stood at the gate and chose the cage instead. There was no scream, no slammed door, no final confrontation etched in fury, just silence. A silence so sacred, it rang in my bones. A decision not made in heat, but in clarity, the kind of clarity that comes after the last tear dries without witness. It didn't happen all at once. The truth rarely does. It builds, like water rising in a room where you once felt safe, until one day your feet no longer touch the floor, and you realize you're drowning in something you kept calling love. The final straw wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday, I think. He made a joke at my expense, again, laughed, then watched to see if I'd laugh too. And I did. A soft, dry sound. But inside, something stopped. That night, I sat on the floor of my bedroom with the lamp on low, hands folded in my lap, breath shallow, eyes fixed on nothing. There were no sobs left to offer, just a quiet knowing, a sacred ache. You can only explain yourself to someone so many times before you begin to realize. The misunderstanding is intentional. I had tried to make my love legible, tried to translate my silence, my boundaries, my depth, into a language he could read. But he wasn't illiterate. He just didn't want to understand. That was the night I stopped hoping he would. I didn't leave in rage. Rage is for the betrayed. I had already mourned. What I left in was reverence, for the part of me that remembered what peace felt like. I remember my hands. They moved slowly, folding clothes not out of urgency, but ritual. Each shirt, each item, a soft goodbye to the version of me that kept waiting. A packing not just of objects, but of selves. I zipped the bag with care, as if sealing something sacred. I looked around the room, not with nostalgia, but with detachment. This was never my home. I had just tried to decorate the illusion. The air was still when I closed the door. No words exchanged, no explanations offered, because sometimes the loudest goodbye is the one you don't say. He would wonder, He would blame. He would reframe. But it didn't matter anymore, because I had finally learned. Love doesn't chase. Love doesn't beg. Love doesn't shrink itself to fit the contours of someone else's denial. Love frees. And when it's time to choose between saving them or saving yourself, you learn that the most holy thing you can do is let go and walk away with your head high, not because you won, but because you remembered who you are. They didn't notice when I went quiet. They noticed when their echo disappeared. At first, they believed it was just another pause in the cycle, the game they always reset, where distance was temporary and silence was just a setup for a louder return. They waited, smug, certain, expecting the familiar rhythm. Withdrawal, then reconciliation. Hurt, then appeasement. Chaos, then comfort. They thought the mirror would return because it always had. But this time, the silence stayed. No messages. No explanations. No subtle cues to draw them back into performance. Only quiet. A hollow, unresponsive quiet. And that's when they began to feel it. Not grief, they don't know grief. Not remorse, they've never let it in that far. But disruption. Disorientation. Because their world is built like a stage and I had been the audience. The spotlight, the applause, the approval wrapped in tenderness. Without me, there was no one to clap. No one to reflect the illusion back to them with softness. No one to bend their cruelty into meaning. They looked around, and the room felt colder. Not because I took anything, but because what I brought was never theirs to keep. Warmth. Listening. A soul that made their mask feel human for a while. Now the laughter they once exaggerated for effect echoes too long in empty rooms. The charm they deploy at parties lands without weight. The stories they tell fall flat, because no one's gaze mirrors wonder anymore. And it dawns slowly, then all at once. The validation wasn't in the words I gave. It was in the way I saw them. And now they are unseen. They try to fill the space, louder posts, louder gestures, louder performances. But the louder they become, the more obvious the emptiness is. Because they were never the source of light. They were only ever illuminated in someone else's. Flashback. I remember the mornings they would speak, just to be heard. The way they'd wait for my eyes to soften, my voice to respond. A simple, "You're amazing," after they recited their self-made mythology. And I would say it, sometimes, not because I believed every word, but because I believed in them. Or, rather, in the possibility of them. Now, there's no one to believe on their behalf. No one to mirror back the version they wish they were. Only the reflection they see now, raw, unadorned, cracked. They call it betrayal. They call it abandonment. They tell others I changed, that I became cold. But what really changed was their access to the illusion. And what they feel now isn't heartbreak. It's absence. The aching kind that settles when silence is no longer a weapon but a wall. They look in the mirror now, not to admire, but to find themselves. And for the first time, they don't know what they're looking at. Because I was the echo. And without it, all that's left is the sound of their own voice. Unanswered, unfiltered, unreflected. And in that emptiness, they finally see. It wasn't about losing me. It was about losing the illusion I once made believable. There was no explosion, no scandal, no shouting match in the street or final scene played out in front of a horrified crowd. Just silence. And then the slow unraveling. At first, no one noticed, not even them. They smiled the same way, laughed in the same pitch, told the same rehearsed stories with just enough inflection to make them seem fresh. But something had shifted, something subtle. The light behind the performance had gone out. They tried to replace me. Of course they did. With someone softer, louder, easier to impress. Someone who would feed the illusion without hesitation. But it didn't work. Not for long. Because once you've been seen in truth, flattery becomes a hollow meal. Once you've been touched by real, fake can't sustain the ego. It spoils on the tongue, curdles in the heart. They clung to new attention like water in a sieve. Charmed, flirted, performed, and yet something always slipped through. The responses were polite, but tepid. The admiration didn't last. No one stayed long enough to keep the story going. Because grace had withdrawn. You see, while I was there, they thought they were the sun. They didn't realize they were only glowing because I was reflecting light. And without that light, everything dimmed. Friendships faded. Connections grew transactional. People they once captivated now looked bored in their presence. Checking phones mid-sentence, smiling out of politeness, eyes flickering toward the exit. The mask had grown thin. The script, tired. The performance, predictable. Their laughter, once infectious, began to feel forced. Like an echo trying to convince itself it was a voice. They blamed the world, of course. Said people were jealous. Said the energy around them had shifted. They even whispered that someone had hexed them, that their luck had run dry. But it wasn't a curse. It was the absence of grace. While I stood beside them, something higher held space for their delay. I had been the buffer between them and consequence. A quiet force that softened the fallout, rewrote their harshness in gentler tones, translated their chaos into something others could momentarily tolerate. But that covering is gone now, and all that remains is the raw echo of their own behavior. Rot doesn't scream, creeps. It erodes the foundation. The smile fades a little earlier. The calls return less often. The charisma cracks under even mild scrutiny. And still, no one says anything. No confrontation. Just distance. Quiet exits. Eyes that no longer linger. They are unraveling. But not with flames. With dust. And I watch it. Not with joy, not with vengeance, but with sorrow. Because I wanted them to rise. I hoped they would meet the mirror with humility. I prayed that grace would be enough. But it wasn't. Not because grace failed, but because they refused it. And now they are learning what happens when the divine steps back. Not through wrath, but through absence. And absence, when it once held love, becomes the loudest silence of all. The phone stayed silent. No midnight calls. No, hey, just thinking about you. No sudden apologies dressed in nostalgia. Not because I was angry, but because I was done. They didn't know what to do with that. In the past, silence was a tool, one they used like a scalpel. To provoke, to punish, to regain control. But my silence now wasn't a tactic. It was a boundary. Permanent, sacred, sealed. They sat in rooms they used to own with their charm. Laughed loudest, told the stories, played the hero. But the rooms feel different now. The attention doesn't land the same. The laughter doesn't echo. And the chair they once occupied like a throne now creaks with discomfort. They are surrounded, yet somehow more alone than ever. Because no one in that room sees them. Not really. Not the way I did. And suddenly they miss it. The way I listened. The way I didn't try to fix, didn't flatter, didn't fall, but stayed. The way I asked questions that lingered long after the lights went out. They scroll through old messages. They reread moments where I forgave too quickly, loved too gently, stayed too long. They trace photos like relics. They type and delete. Type and delete. And sometimes they reach out. A vague song link. A memory. A joke I would have smiled at. But now the text doesn't land. It floats in a void. Because the line they used to pull me back with? It's gone. They might drive by familiar places. Check mutual friends' profiles. Stalk the shadow of my digital presence, hoping to glimpse the version of me that once waited on the edge of their inconsistency. But that version no longer lives here. She grew roots. She grew wings. And she no longer flinches when she hears their name. They don't understand it, not fully. How someone so available became untouchable. How the one who once whispered, "I'll always be here," now disappears when they call. But that's the thing about final tests. You don't always know it's the last until it's already gone. Until the grace dries up. Until the door that was once ajar gently, hopefully, is now shut. Not with anger. With peace. That's what stings them most. Not rejection. But irrelevance. Because in the past, they had power. They could make me doubt. Make me explain. Make me stay. But now? Now I don't explain. I don't justify. I don't need them to understand. I am not waiting for remorse. I am not craving closure. I am no longer hoping they'll become someone they never chose to be. And in that silence, in that locked door, they finally awaken to the truth. They weren't abandoned. They were released. And what they lost wasn't just me. It was their final mirror, their final chance, their final invitation to become more. And they missed it. I wasn't karma. I wasn't punishment. I was the answer to the prayers they whispered in the dark, the ones they never told anyone about. The desperate kind. The silent kind. Send me someone who will stay. Send me someone who won't hurt me. Send me someone who sees me. I was sent, but I was not sent to save them. I was sent to show them what saving themselves could look like. To hold the mirror with tenderness, not accusation. To stand in the chaos and not flinch. To offer, again and again, the quiet invitation to choose truth. And still, they chose the mask. They mistook my softness for strategy, my patience for passivity, my mercy for manipulation, because they had never seen love without conditions. They didn't know what to do with something that didn't want to control them, but elevate them. But grace is not infinite. Grace is not weak. Grace is not blind. Grace sees clearly and stays anyway. Until it doesn't. There comes a moment when grace finishes its assignment. Not in rage, not in noise, but in stillness. A divine hush. The soft close of a door that will never open again. I was that door. I was the final classroom. The last teacher before life would take over the lessons I had tried to offer in love. I did not leave because I was tired. I did not walk away in anger. I left because my presence had become dishonored, my purpose fulfilled, and my light no longer welcomed. You see, when grace is received, it transforms. But when it's rejected, it withdraws. Not out of punishment, but out of timing. Because every offering has a season. And mine had passed. They didn't lose a lover. They lost their last mirror. The only one who looked and didn't flinch. The only one who stayed when truth got uncomfortable. The only one who didn't worship the mask but still loved the soul beneath it. I was never meant to be forever. I was meant to be enough. Enough to wake them. Enough to show them. Enough to give them a choice. And they chose. Not me. Not truth. Not growth. They chose the illusion, the easier path, the familiar role, the fleeting power. And now they will walk that road alone. Not cursed. Not condemned. But unaccompanied by the one presence that could have changed everything. My silence is not empty. It is sacred. It is the final lesson taught without words. The gate has closed. Not slammed, just gently fully. The candle has been blown out, not in haste, but in completion. The voice that once soothed, once pleaded, once believed, is quiet now. Not because it has nothing left to say, but because it has already said everything that could have ever saved them. And when grace leaves, it does not return. It becomes memory. It becomes legend. It becomes the moment they remember. Every time someone else walks away. But never the way I did.